Welcome back to another episode of the 706 podcast, the podcast where we debate, argue, and decide which movies are the 706 greatest of all time. And for today's episode, we have Pee-wee's Big Adventure, the second Big Adventure film that we've discussed in this podcast, and hopefully one that will have better results than that one, which shall remain nameless forever from here on out. But I'm your host today, Anthony, and we are, in any order,
Connor.
Tony.
Connor.
Kirk.
Tony.
Connor.
and I'm your host, Anthony.
I
we'll
will
get that
just say,
down one day.
you know, Paul Rubin's death hit me harder than since I learned about Thomas Jefferson dying. I don't know if I've actually had a death as impactful.
Okay, so for today's episode, we're discussing Pee-wee's Big Adventure from 1985. Now, the reason I chose this movie is I had, nominated a few different Tim Burton movies, and it's kind of hard on reflection to know what Tim Burton movie would have a chance in the 706 canon, just because we all have kind of different tastes. Maybe Ed Wood would probably have the best shot. I had tried, I think, before to get Edward Scissorhands or Sweeney Todd up for discussion. Sadly, didn't go through for whatever reason at the time. But we ended up with Pee-wee, which Kirk selected last week, if I remember right. And for those who don't know, it is kind of a spin-off, kind of parody of a Bicycle Thieves sort of plot line in which Pee-wee, our titular character, has his bike stolen and he ends up on a quest, not quite across America, but across part of America to retrieve it, only for the shenanigans to ensue. So I called this movie a kind of fascinating pick for me, and I meant it totally earnest. Not only because it's Tim Burton's first movie, it seems bustling with creativity and a kind of energy that does seem lacking from him in the decades since, and especially in the last couple decades, post Planet of the Apes, I'd say. But there's a kind of weird, I think, tradition in this movie. I feel like it kind of is an heir to a sort of Buster Keaton style comedy. It's the mainstream version of The Wizard of Space and Time in some ways, or as mainstream as we could say it is. Now, this movie was kind of a box office hit. It was based on a popular TV show, originally meant for adults, that became kind of a weird middle ground of, energy, satire, and all sorts of other things that we, will hopefully get a chance to talk about. Now, I won't say much more. Let's go straight to the opinions. Did this movie work at all? Was it funny? Was it irritating? Did it seem redeemable? Did it seem worth discussing? Especially since we did a Wizard of Space and Time 10, 15 episodes ago. Now, I see Connor smiling. I see Tony looking angry. I see Kirk once again threatening to storm off the set. But let's start with Kirk, since he picked the film.
I feel like this is our baby, Anthony, in the sense that, I brought this episode into existence, as did you. And when you have a child and they commit a horrific, heinous act, society naturally looks at you to bear some of the culpability. And in this instance, I feel extremely guilty of bringing this abomination forward and allowing it to become part of our discourse. I don't know. No, okay, I'll back up a little bit. When Paul Rubens died, I didn't care at all because I had absolutely no semblance of associations developed with his character, Pee Wee Herman. It's kind of like a term that you heard, growing up. I didn't really, understand who Pee Wee Herman was, a name. And I never saw anything with him in it. I never saw the children's show. Maybe it was a little past my time to land for me. I'm not sure. I'm interested to hear the three of you discuss that because, by the time it came out, maybe I was too old. But so I'm just going into this film watching this kind of neurotic, histrionic recluse who is overly eccentric and has a variety of affectations that are extremely annoying. I'm not. There's nothing there for me to be like, to have callbacks to. Like, and I guess maybe at this point in time, The show hadn't aired, so maybe there aren't references that I'm missing. Maybe there are, from the HBO stuff. But I thought, just kind of fumbled along a little bit in the beginning. We start to get some semblance of a plot when his bike is stolen. Then you kind of understand where the movie's headed. It's lighthearted, it's fun to an extent when it's not so grating. Believe me, it feels grating. Is it creative? Yes, to an extent. I do believe that Tim Burton's kind of youthful enthusiasm is on display as much as it can be in this film. I do wonder how much of that creativity was kind of channeled by matter of convenience toward, like, LA and LA centric ideas and movie making. And sometimes you wonder, like, is this the best choice for the movie, or did they really just like want to save some money and they just filmed this entire chase scene on the lot with random costumes and set pieces that they had lying around, right? And so that's, the cynical side of me. And I think overall I'm far too cynical to enjoy this movie, really, without the influence of some very heavy hallucinogenic substances. I think it would be tough for me to unironically enjoy this film past the age of 9, maybe. I don't know. I think that's more of a shortcoming on my end than it is. I think there are very few films that can channel or harness, amplify that inner child anymore. Far too desensitized and scarred, I guess, to really appreciate them and appreciate the type of humor that's on display. Speaking of the humor, I do think there's a version of this film that works, but my main issue with it is that there's no straight guy in this film. Everybody that he interacts with throughout this adventure is seemingly as deluded and as out of touch with reality and the principles of modern society as he is. So, you look at films that kind of chronicle a journey, specifically like a cross-country adventure. You look at something like, I don't know, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, or maybe like Due Date, right? Those movies both had straight guys. They had Steve Martin, they had Robert Downey Jr. to kind of add a little bit of contrast to the utter, caricaturized protagonist. And in this film, we don't have that. Everybody he meets is, just as loony as he is. And for me, I think there would be some real value in seeing how somebody who's more anchored in reality would perceive somebody like Pee Wee Herman. But he's always, he always comes out of situations seemingly with a sense of wherewithal and an ability to conquer whatever situation he's put into. So I think this film requires a high level of investment in the idea that this is fun and this is lighthearted and we're just gonna have some kind of chuckle a little bit. It's almost like going to like a circus as an adult, or going to, I don't know, going to something that is very tailored to kids, but you just can't escape your ego. You can't escape your perspective. So with that being said, I think it's, it just failed for what I was hoping for, I guess. Maybe I'm not even really sure what I was hoping for. Maybe something a little more zany, a little more edgy. A lot of the jokes were just kind of very, very genteel, very restrained. And, maybe that's the shock humor that we were all raised on, I think is sorely lacking in this film. So it does feel like it didn't age as well as it could have. But then again, I don't have that emotional connection to the character and to the person, Paul Rubens. So, maybe it's not for me, and Tony and Connor will just be like, yeah, I loved it. It was amazing. But I feel like, it's, my opinions are kind of falling in the same area as they did with Wizard of Space and Time to that extent. So, but I'm interested to hear, Anthony, more about why you love the film, because as we know, I'm notorious for changing course. I'm highly suggestible, so don't lose hope, don't lose faith, in my boat. All right.
I wish we had like a statistic on how many times Kirk actually flips one to the other, because I actually feel like you've been more stable lately, Kirk. I don't think you've actually converted so much in your opinions. But okay, so there's a fascinating thing. I guess maybe you wanted an edge to the zaniness, or kind of a dose of a larger reality, our reality, within this world in some sort of fashion, whether through an avatar in another character, or in the bitingness of the humor, or added bitingness of the humor. I don't, maybe that's what you were kind of going for, but we could get more into that in a second. Let's go with Connor next, if that's okay.
I feel like this movie is so crazy. You have to watch it when you're high, bro. Okay, and I never thought I would say that, but this movie I feel like kind of qualified. I think it would have been improved. Okay, why? Sort of disconnected vignettes, this picaresque adventure, very fun, set pieces, cool, but with not that much to hold it together. I wasn't left wondering. I wasn't left waiting for anything, like it was just kind of like I'm watching this thing play out. Now, of course, okay, like I can't knock it, right? Like as Anthony said, like he checked all the boxes of the movies that I would compare it to. We can think of Girl Shy, not a Buster Keaton, but like a silent movie. Like it kind of reminds me of that silent movie with the long chase sequence at the end. It has certainly Wizard of Speed and Time was kind of a weird, very idiosyncratic version of this movie in a way. There's a certain movie that it definitely reminds me of that we cannot mention. We're not allowed to mention. We also watch for this podcast. To me, it conjures up also a kind of a whole, like kind of, it has all of the DNA of all of like the VHS classics. I'm talking Flubber. I'm talking Baby's Day Out. I'm talking, there are like elements that sort of recurred for me as I watched it that, I guess activated some kind of pleasure center for me as I watched. The thing that I like most about it, you can see the Tim Burton zaniness and fun, love of fun is there, the not taking itself seriously, the silliness that it becomes appealing again when you drop your adult sort of skepticism or what have you. Obviously, I think like to me the coolest sequence is the ending where we see the movie within the movie and the contrast of Pee-wee's actual adventure and this kind of like heteronormative kind of like Hollywood schlock kind of like version of his story, which has been done before, but I thought it was effective. And seeing all of the people come back, that's just a nice. All the characters come back and are at the drive-in. That was a very nice sequence, and I love Francis, and that's all I'll say.
All right. Well, we're gonna have to ask about this more later on, but Connor wants to leave us hanging, and he wants to have us on the edge of our seats because Tony's here next, and he has the stage. What do you have to say, Tony?
Yeah, I thought this movie was really fun. I don't know what I don't know what you guys really expected from this movie. I guess I'm a little confused by what you went into it thinking it was going to be. I mean, I was laughing pretty consistently from beginning to end. I mean, I guess like, yeah, it's just these series of kind of silly vignettes. Does it have anything that like, ties it all together and really brings it up to that like top level with like, the great comedies? I don't know, but I mean, it's funny, it's amusing. I think it does exactly like what it is supposed to do. I can see why people wouldn't like this movie. If you find Paul Rubens' antics grating, then yes, of course you're not going to like the movie. And I can definitely see people who would find him to be like an obnoxious kind of character, and is in the same way there are people who find like Jim Carrey obnoxious or something, right? Because he does like a very particular kind of thing. But I think if you can just, kind of give yourself to the movie and follow it where it goes, there's a lot of fun little moments and surprises. The large Marge scene I thought was great, where she turns into this kind of demon and it has this very menacing feel. It's just great. I mean, I think this is a movie that kind of captures the feeling of childhood, just like sort of like it's a movie that I think really would, appeal to kids and kind of takes me back to that place watching it. It does feel like a movie I would have watched on VHS. It's kind of it's one of those things. It's like I don't know what that means or how you came up with that, but it's very true. Like it definitely is true. I feel like I own the VHS somewhere in my house. Like I exist now that I've seen the movie. But like the large Marge scene, but Francis was fantastic. I mean, the scene where Francis is taking his bath, and it's this like swimming pool, and he's a grown man and he's playing with his toys. I mean, I was dying. Like, how is that not? And then Paul Rubens comes in and attacks him. Like that sequence was amazing. It was so good. It was so good. And then the ending where they bring all the characters back is great. I love, and of course I'd love this, the parody movie we see where we see the Hollywood adaptation of his story with was that Burt Reynolds? I mean, that was so good. I mean, there's
Charlton Heston. Was it Burt Reynolds? I didn't even look up actually.
No,
I have to
not
look it up.
either of those. It was someone else. I can't remember his name.
Oh, okay. So I've shown my ass here by saying Burt Reynolds. That's just who I thought. But I thought that was such a clever little. I mean, I'm a sucker for those little like meta goofy moments, but like things like that to me like kind of put the movie just over the top a little bit in terms of like the level of zaniness, the level of fun. I guess that like it wasn't quite as zany as it could have been. There's definitely some visual imagination on display, but it wasn't quite as kind of, I guess, expressionistic or as wild as I was really expecting. I mean, there's definitely sequences that are like that, with like the dream sequence where he's worried about what's happening to his bike. I thought we'd get a little bit more of that, and maybe I was mildly disappointed about that. But I think moment to moment, I think all the vignettes pretty much work. I think all the little side characters are fun. I liked the whole sequence with the bikers in the bar. I mean, just go down the list. I think they all basically worked. I was pretty charmed. I thought, I mean, Paul Rubens, I mean, I had no familiarity. I never seen this movie before. I never watched the TV show. I didn't really know what Pee-wee's Playhouse was really even about. In that it's like, I kind of heard it was a kid show, but I know it has a lot of adult fans, and I was like kind of unsure what I wasn't really sure what exactly it is going into it. But yeah, I mean, to me, it appeals to me in the exact same way like SpongeBob SquarePants appeals to me, right? I mean, like that's a show that I have very fond memories of watching it as a kid. And I think it's like the same basic like kind of humor. I mean, to me at least. I mean, he's very much like a SpongeBob kind of character. Kirk disagrees, I see, but that's all right. We don't have to agree on everything. But yeah, no, I was smiling pretty much all the way through. I thought the bicycle thieves kind of spoof gimmick plot was I'm being pooped. I'm being given a poop emoji. That's a first on this podcast. Not even during Simon Killer did I get a poop emoji, although that one was recorded in person. So, but yeah, I thought that gimmick or that plot line was very effective as kind of a through line for the movie. I like too the way the movie is constantly kind of undercutting itself. The fact that he has to go to the basement of the Alamo because the psychic is just basically making shit up. Great. So yeah, is this movie a timeless masterpiece? I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think that for what it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to do, I think it's exactly what it needs to be. I was thoroughly entertained by the movie.
This is great. I love when we have diverse reactions across the board, and a lot of different things we're picking and pulling at. I think SpongeBob is a great kind of signifier in some ways. SpongeBob feels like the continued evolution of this type of character. This is the type of movie I don't know if I'll exactly have a way of intellectualizing. In some ways, it seems to defeat or kind of slip away from that sort of impulse, although maybe there is something there, and I'll get to that in a second. Now, I will say, as everyone kept bringing up the TV show, and from what I know, like I said, I haven't done my research, but if I have this right, Pee-wee and Paul Rubens and as Pee-wee, as the character of Pee-wee, kind of goes through an interesting evolution before this movie. Paul Rubens tries out for SNL, does not get it in 1980. What he does get, though, is the attention, of course, of two really prominent comedians, Cheech and Chong. And he ends up doing not only one of their films, but he ends up opening for them across the West Coast. And The show and his opening gets so much attention, he ends up doing a kind of stint at the Roxy Theater, which gains the attention, or he uses to gain the attention of studio executives to not only pitch the eventual show, but for the movie. The movie actually comes out before the HBO show, which of course becomes a cult classic. Now he develops this version of Pee-wee with Phil Hartman in mind, or sorry, with Phil Hartman on his side. Of course, the legendary Simpsons voice, SNL actor, of course, tragic ending there. But the show eventually has a bunch of other kind of famous, people who come aboard. Everyone from Magic Johnson to Whitney Houston to Lawrence Fishburne ends up being kind of a regular on the show. But the movie comes first. So, people are coming to it without the familiarity that may be suggested by a show. But at the same time, when he's coming up with a show, him and Phil Hartman are trying to figure something out, which was, how do we do this character when we originally intended it for adults, when kids are also seem to get really into it? So there's a weird bridge I think they have to play with here. Now, when it comes to the actual movie itself, the way I described it last time, I think is the perfect metaphor for it, which is I feel like someone took Mad Magazine and just threw it on the screen for an hour and a half. If you are familiar with those kind of cartoonish pictorials they used to do. The other way I like to think about this, and I just thought of this, but it's something I've talked about before, is David Letterman, when he was on late night, used to do this thing. I don't know if anyone remembered this, but he would tell a joke and everyone would laugh. The very next night, he would tell the same joke and people would laugh. And what he would do is the very next night, he would tell it again. And eventually people would start to be familiar with it, that the laughs would kind of die out little by little. But he would keep telling the same joke, even when there was no laughter and even when people started getting annoyed. But finally, the reason he said he kept telling it was because people eventually came around to it and they started laughing again. Now, what I think we are with this film is kind of somewhere in the middle. I think we are meant at times to be infuriated, to be annoyed, to be impulsed by some of Pee-wee's moments, that we are not meant to always be on his board of, are we really supposed to enjoy this laughter every single time it comes? But I think kind of like that Letterman story, there are moments where I go from, okay, I'm tired of this, to all of a sudden, hey, I'm kind of back with this movie. And I find that kind of very pleasurable, very exciting. And I think Pee-wee comes in a very particular moment in the 1980s. He has a kind of origin in like this like punk movement of a kind of character who's willing to see everything as kind of zany, willing to see everything as kind of ridiculous except for that one item he wants, who's on board and coming out and merging as a character the same time Devo's like a huge band, the same time electronic 80s music is coming to the scene. Everything in his home feels like a retro futuristic world that just is like not quite right. And by the time he gets to reality, I don't know, Kirk, I think we don't necessarily have a straight version of what the world is, but there are holes I think we see. I think we get peeks at it in the way people laugh at him, in the way a character like the diner waitress isn't quite able to leave an abusive boyfriend or hint of an abusive boyfriend. The way the person who picks him up on the road is obviously someone violent, and he's willing to kind of hide it in this absurd story about cutting the do not remove tags on mattresses. And everything, I think, kind of emerges in this kind of ridiculous, fantastical world that, may not be on board with the whole time, but hopefully, like, once again, the Letterman story, you eventually kind of come to see something kind of absurd about it, which is why I think the ending of that movie is so perfect. And I came back to this movie in the last 6 months because I was thinking to myself how influential it actually has become in weird kind of ways, not just SpongeBob. And I don't want to spoil it, but if you've seen the show Barry, this movie obviously would play a huge role, and Bill Hader would later confirm it, in the kind of storyline and story choices of that show, and a handful of other kind of things I don't want to get into now just for the sake of time. But I think there's something a little bit more there, and I think there's something interesting with the movie itself. Now, the pieces are pieces. I don't think there's a kind of substantive quality sometimes to them, or an additive quality to them, but I think there's something a little bit more that we could get at. Now, I won't take up more time, but I'll get to some of the things we've talked about. And I think what we all want to know first and foremost is Frances, Connor. What is your fascination? What is your love for Frances?
It's just great how it starts with them both being boys. We kind of don't have any other context. They're clearly supposed to be boys. And then we also later we meet actual like school age children. So I just like the kind of the zaniness of that. And that initial interaction between them, we just instantly know who these characters are. We know exactly who Francis is. His little embroidered his initials on his bathrobe. It's very nice. Francis is very good. But yeah, I mean, what I'm thinking is it's like SpongeBob is quite good, but does SpongeBob get into the 706? Like we can say that we enjoy this. So like touches our pleasure centers. Okay, it's a weird way of putting it, but you know what I mean. It affects us. We feel nostalgia. We're intrigued. But I think when Tony says, "What more were you expecting?" When someone recommends something 706, I do expect the kind of like, maybe it doesn't have to be immediately apparent, but a certain kind of like larger thing it's going for, a thing it's trying to say. And Tim Burton's movies do have that. Ed Wood, you mentioned. There is a narrative being propounded in that movie that maybe kind of it has sort of resonances in this movie, but it's not developed. It's not made out into anything. It's not like it's really Pee-wee against the world, or I don't see it that way. I mean, there's ultimately at the end, there's something with the contrast between Pee-wee, who he actually is, and what the movie of his life is supposed to be, and then that doesn't bother him. Sure, okay, but like I don't know, like, and I think like other than the fact that the bicycle is stolen, where's like the bicycle thief like connection? I don't know. I don't really particularly remember that movie, but like I'm not seeing where the gravitas, the grandeur comes in. I know not every movie has to be that, but I would say for the 706, I need a case to be made. I think Anthony probably can make it, but I want to hear him make it and elaborate a little bit more, or I can hear from my co-host as well.
Well, I have a question then to follow up on that, Connor. I think that's a good point, but when you think about like the great comedies of all time, I mean, would you put, I mean, I don't know if we'll do episodes on these at any point, but just in just off the cuff, would you put like Airplane or Monty Python and the Holy Grail in the 706? I mean, maybe you can make a case that those are greater works of art than this movie, but I don't know where do those compare?
Well, I mean, if it had, it would have to have something more to it, I guess like Holy Grail, of course. I mean, I'm not saying, I think those I wouldn't necessarily. Sure, they might get a shot at the 706, but like I think there has to be something more going on. A comedy can be very clever. Comedies historically can be very revealing, right? Satirical, biting. They can have lots of themes. They can reveal a lot, right? I don't think comedy precludes that. It can be zany, of course. I'm not saying it's like, there's no intellectual value or no craft in that, but if you see what I'm saying.
Here's something curious. Oh, sorry, go finish, Connor. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I guess I can't quite refute what Tony is saying. He does have a point, but yeah, I still kind of trying to stand by what I said. But
I mean, so many of the great, like, so-called great comedies, it's an interesting word you use, Connor, gravitas, and I don't think you necessarily mean it in the sense of like it needs to have like a, oh god, they need to save the world type element, but like a kind of feeling of grandeur for even these characters, which is like, I don't know, what's a great comedy like Annie Hall or something, which is like as simple as like a love story. Can he get the girl back, or take it back further to Girl Shy, which I think got in right to the 706. Like the simplistic argument about that movie is it's someone who just wants to figure out what love is like and to go after it using a kind of playbook, right? Is he going to learn that he can't just use a playbook to fall in love, to find the right woman, however we want to spin that theme here though? And I don't necessarily think I can make an argument maybe that would satisfy you, or if I can even make an argument that satisfies your conditions here though. We have a character who sheds all of that. Dottie, is of course a love interest in a way that he just is not interested because he's kind of a grown-up child. Does he even reciprocate these feelings in some way? There seems to be a hint of something, but probably not. or maybe, I don't know, but like, we could probably go back and forth all day. At the same time, I would say one thing about this movie is everybody brought up how what's fascinating is none of you had seen it as a child, but you all claim that this movie made you feel like you should have seen it as a child, which is kind of an interesting thing. But I will say this, if we go back to that, if we think about it as a movie that wants to replicate what childhood is like, there's something this movie is doing. Unlike SpongeBob, which does it in a few episodes, this movie is saying, here's a kind of childish reality. We're going to get a version of that that's made fun of, that's parodied in a kind of Hollywood satire of what they want the story to be. That's the ending film. But along the way, what we have is a childish reaction to the world, a childish reaction to the violence, to, losing the most precious item you have. But along the way, what we have are sneak peeks at the horror of what's going on out there. Incarceration, a person in prison, someone more violent than they seem, Large Marge, a kind of ridiculous trope of, the long distance working class kind of stories people sharing. There are moments meant, and I think the movie does this even literally. This is a style over substance thing. The movie literally throws us into darkness quite often. There's even a part where like we have cartoon eyes, and when he flips the match, what he sees is this nightmarish wildlife around him. And what's one of the scariest moments of the film isn't just his nightmare of what could be happening to his bike by clowns smashing it, but it's the most common primal child fear, just being left alone when he's stuck in the road and nothing's around him and he's in the dark. Isn't that in some ways a kind of grandeur too? Just to recapture some of that feeling that we've kind of forgotten. Like we hear about this with movies all the time. It was like something done in the Harry Potter series, like, oh yeah, like she plays on that kind of idea. And we could go on, but that's just a kind of idea off the cuff. I don't know. Kirk, everything we're saying, you were so frustrated with the movie, wanting an Avatar, everything we're saying, does Connor seem to have hit some of the buttons that were frustrating you in what he's saying? And he had some compliments, whereas you seem to have almost a very limited supply of them, but
Yeah, my compliments are lacking. Just overall, I mean, I don't know if like making something purposefully obtuse means it like propels it into a higher level of art. Like, I think there was more to like, like Andy Kaufman's work or Dave Letterman's work, or even something like SpongeBob. I just think this movie is like purposefully inaccessible at times and kind of petulant. I don't even know if the character is like, Pee Wee Herman is meant to be a child. I don't think he possesses the naivete to be seen as one. He's just kind of fucking annoying. Like I don't know how else to say it. Like he's incredibly annoying from like the very first moment of the film and his laugh, and it just I kind of think it probably said it. The movie was kind of charting a course that I would never be okay with. When I think about comedies that have really stood the test of time, there usually is an emotional hook, unless it's incredibly superb in the comedy it depicts. It's something that you just can't replicate or can't even fathom how it would be replicated. Think about like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, right? Think about the fact that movie can actually make you cry when you hear, what John Candy, his actual story and his wife. And there's a million examples. More recently, we have, something that could be somewhat comparable. I mean, like something like Hot Rod, right? Wasn't that with Andy Samberg?
yeah.
Was that? Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's something missing here. There's an emotional arc. What has Pee Wee learned? How has he evolved? How has he progressed as a character? That's the point, I guess, is that he's just this immutable force that cannot be challenged, nor can he be redirected in any way. And for that, he's lovable, I guess, or he's at least pleasurably enigmatic. So I feel like the character, the general philosophy of the film, it's all something that is locked away from me to be able to access and enjoy. And I think that's a deeply personal thing, and Tony's kind of biting comment, what did you expect? Well, just because something's a comedy, like I said, I'll just circle back to that. I don't think there's anything here that has even the slightest amount of substance in a lasting way, unless you want to just go for the fact that, this character is kind of exemplifies a type of comedy that is harder to access and thus is more profound, maybe, or, because it feels a little experimental, it's more intellectual for people that really get comedy. Like that's what I kind of get a little bit of vibes from that. It's like you're not on the plane of existence where you can really understand the brilliance of this film. And maybe I'm not. I don't know. I feel like that's all bluster. But I would need a more in-depth explanation of why that is than just the fact that this is like a character who's basically doing the same bit, and then it kind of grabs your attention, and your attention wanes and you become frustrated, but you come back to it. I don't know. Is that better comedy than something that's funny throughout? Or, is the idea that it's funny in spite of itself, which this movie isn't, in my opinion, is that enough of a redeeming factor? But yeah, those are, I'm just kind of rehashing my thoughts. I don't know. I mean, the dinosaur scene, that the ex-boyfriend or the boyfriend, those are some funny, some funny gags, but ultimately, I just feel like they were few and far between from my perspective.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to be biting. I mean, I think that I think you're right that most like classic comedies, like we've done comedies on the podcast before, obviously, and there's a number of comedies that we've, inducted. And generally, if we go down the list, like When Harry Met Sally, I don't think that got in, but whatever, When Harry Met Sally or Girl Shy or whatever, there's some other element. There is an emotional element, or there's a thematic element, or there's some extra piece of the puzzle, as kind of you and Connor both alluded to, that kind of gives it an additional, that either makes the movie more of a resonant piece of art, or makes us comfortable as kind of critics or as movie fans to kind of give it that laurel and say, okay, it's good enough for us to induct. It's good enough for us to say. I think, however, for me with comedy, I don't always need that. Like, to me, and you alluded earlier to it with the idea of like there being a straight man in the movie, right? Like in comedy, you often have a straight man. You have the kind of the wacky character, and you have the more realistic character to provide some contrast. And that often works very well. There's a reason that's done in most comedies. However, I think when you're in the world of absurdism, which is where this movie is playing, a straight man, for me anyway, can kind of take away from it. Because I think the function of a straight man sometimes is to kind of signal to the audience that the people making the movie are aware that it's silly. They're like, don't get me wrong, we're not like this. We know this is silly. It's supposed to be silly. And it kind of distances the artist from the product or the vision or whatever, the piece of art, right? I really like comedy that is in that world, that lives in that zany world, without providing that distance, without providing something quote unquote realistic to kind of ground it or to make it more accessible to most audience members, I guess. Like that's a subjective thing. And I really like absurdism. I really like surrealism. I also really like movies and TV shows, pieces of art in general, that really commit to the vision they set out to tell. To me, the fact that Pee-wee doesn't change, the fact that Pee-wee is just Pee-wee and is acting like Pee-wee the whole movie, is a strength of the movies, right? Like that to me is something that I find very endearing about it. If Pee-wee had learned some sort of valuable lesson by the end, I think that for me would have taken away from the movie. His, childlike naivete, the fact that the movie is so low stakes, it's just about a bike, And that's all it's ever about. And the, you know, quote unquote love story is completely deconstructed and completely diffused. I mean, in a way, yeah, that is sort of a subverting audience expectations in a way. That is sort of, I mean, I can see how that would be, you know, alienating for some. But in terms of my subjective, what I look for in comedy and what I enjoy, this movie basically ticked all the boxes. And I think too that when a movie, I think too, because of the subjective nature of comedy, I think that a version of this movie that you liked, like let's say, like, I don't know if you like Airplane, but let's say you like Airplane, and let's say you're laughing beginning, middle, and end in Airplane, to use that example I used earlier, you would be much more lenient on the movie. I think it just comes down to subjectively, what do we find funny, right? And if I'm laughing beginning to end in a movie, even if it lacks that emotional hook, even if it lacks that thematic element, I'll forgive basically anything, because that is valuable in itself. I think comedy is a valid goal in itself, and that great comedy is something we can and that we should celebrate. And I think too, as Anthony kind of alluded to, I think that there's always things you can kind of pull out of that. I think the fact that this movie does put us in that childhood perspective so successfully and through the entire runtime is an aesthetic triumph. You know, I think it really is, you know, so I would defend the movie on those grounds.
That was very, very nicely said, Tony. And I have some more things to say, but I'll let Connor go.
I just want to say that was a little backhanded, Tony. You know, I don't need the director to offer that distance. I can formulate that myself.
I wasn't trying to be backhanded at all. I was trying to be as diplomatic as possible. That's how I feel about it. You know what I mean?
When you like Oppenheimer, Kirk, you learn things.
I watch a movie and I'm somebody who, if they don't say, you know, at the end, if like I have to look at the credits to make sure that the people that were in the movie aren't the actual people that, you know, like I was shocked to learn that Cillian Murphy wasn't actually Oppenheimer. So sometimes it's hard.
Okay, so Anthony, stop me if I'm saying anything that's like you're gonna get to it, okay? Because I don't want to. So, but I think Tony and Kirk are missing something here, which is that there is an arc in the movie. It's very conventional in a way. Because remember that we have this thing of, okay, so like I would say, speaking of like straight man, okay, funny choice of words. We have a sort of straight girl of sorts. We have Dottie, who is the conventional love interest. Now, I don't think we're supposed to laugh at Dottie. We're supposed to really kind of feel for Dottie. We understand that she really likes Pee-wee, and that Pee-wee doesn't seem to notice her, doesn't know really what she wants, you know, that we really want Pee-wee to take her to the drive. And I think we really do believe that. Now, we understand this is something that's kind of like unlikable about Pee-wee, that he doesn't seem to return Dottie's affections, that he's kind of full of himself, right? And so about, you know, a third of the way through, kind of in the end of the second act, right, we learn that like Pee-wee like says, I've learned humility. It's kind of like, I've been using this term lampshade. I don't know. It's just like, it's intentionally almost conventional. Like there's something a little bit silly about it. Like, how did he learn the humility exactly? But that humility is supposed to somehow then come back and inform like the fact that at the end of the day, he gives up the bicycle to save the pets. And that itself is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, like classic, like almost kind of textbook, but kind of the fire in the pet store kind of comes out of nowhere. It's sort of like, you know, there's something kind of funny, but also like, I don't know, like it's almost too ironic. It doesn't like come down to a theme to me. And the fact that he's like distributing the popcorn, all the snacks at the end to all of his friends, I think that's supposed to be a sign that he kind of has learned like the value of other people and serving others, you know, so that almost is a kind of a conventional thing. And I don't know how that hangs together with, you know, what I would imagine people would want to say about this is like, oh, look, like, you know, like there's a kind of fundamental queerness to Pee-wee Herman, right? That he's like, he resists our kind of like our these normative claims on our subjectivities or whatever. But I'm not sure that's true, because there is actually kind of a conventional plot and a conventional change that I think there's a reason why the other two didn't mention it, because it doesn't feel like it matters, because it's kind of like a Band-Aid on, it's a theme kind of painted onto the movie that doesn't seem to really like run through it. But
no, that's fascinating, Connor. And I don't mean to fully disagree with you, but I will say I think you're a little off. I mean, this is the way I read it. I think you're right. I think we're being built up to think there's a conventional movie, or at least a conventional arc. For Pee Wee to say, I've learned humility, it is kind of this like, oh, off funny moment with Dottie that we kind of laugh at. And yeah, he hands out the snacks, but I don't think he's learned it at all. And I think it's actually just the right thing to say at that moment, because what happens in the next part is we get the meta movie, and he doesn't want to watch it. And it's not, he doesn't want to watch it because he wants to go hang out with Dottie or do something else with his friends. He doesn't want to watch it because what does he say? I've lived it. After he's watched most of, and it's James Brolin, I had to look it up to confirm, I always mix them up. After he's watched James Brolin, a much more handsome, conventionally Hollywood version of the story play out, we've already seen the scenes that have kind of usurped the sexless, romantic dialogue with him and Dottie. All of a sudden, she's an attractive model for the period. And, the Pee Wee on screen is kind of, having a moment with her after fighting off ninjas wanting to steal his bike. He gives the famous line once again in a much more suave way. I'm a loner, Dottie. I'm a rebel. So I don't know if he's fully learned humility, but I think what the real lesson he's learned is he's learned to at least accept other people a little bit more. And what he does is he rides off, not just with Dottie, but he rides off with his bike and her, and he rides off with another pet and her, and and the other dog. So I think that's the real kind of potential lesson if you really want to read for it. But I think we're meant to, because that meta movie happens so immediately after, I think we're meant to laugh at the humility part. I don't think we're meant to really think that's kind of correct. I think what we have is Pee-wee's the same as he always was. He just recognizes that the bike is not necessarily the end all be all. And what's funny is in the beginning of the movie, the authorities, the cops are telling him it's just a bike. Like, we can't devote our resources to it. So I don't know. I mean, I kind of want to pull back a little on what you're saying, Connor. I also wanted just to throw in to get back to Tony and Kirk's point, and I know we're getting close to or over time, so we can head to voting soon. I mean, there's nothing worse than trying to explain comedy or trying to explain a joke, but I find it fascinating at the same time. To go back to what I was saying with like the kind of silent tradition and, Harold Lloyd or even a Charlie Chaplin, I suppose those characters for someone like you, Kirk, have things to pull for them. Harold Lloyd is a regular guy who just wants a girl to get a good job, and he learns those things along the way. The tramp, Charlie Chaplin, is always trying just to do the right thing, and it's something to root for him against all odds. I don't know, like maybe there's a version of Pee-wee that might be closer to not just SpongeBob, but someone like even Will Ferrell and Elf. Like Will Ferrell and Elf doesn't change. The world changes, or like his family changes to like get to what he has to say, and he brings them in. I mean, that's kind of the closest analog I could think of. But you're right, Pee-wee doesn't necessarily change, at least the way I read it. He's just kind of this forever man child. And to me, that's what I was kind of getting at when I say there's something kind of punk about this, in the way he's dressed up in this kind of 50s Little Rascals mock look, 50s kind of salesman parody almost. And yeah, I don't know much more to say about that, but I know we want to get on. I know it's kind of late, so we can move on. Let's throw Tony first. I feel like he never votes first.
All right. Well, I'm going to pull the reverse Kirk and say this movie actually sucks ass. It may have been funny. I may have enjoyed it, but it's dog shit. Who are we kidding? No, I'm a yes. I enjoyed it. I think that in defending the movie, I may have almost overstated my enjoyment of it. I don't. It's not like one of my all time favorites or anything, but I was smiling from beginning to end. I admired its chutzpah. I liked its moxie. I liked that it committed to what it was. And to me, I think the most important thing, if I have one trait that I look for in movies, whether it's Barney's Great Adventure or Martyrs, it's that it is what it is, and it makes no apologies for it, and it just goes for it. And this movie absolutely does that. So I would say yes for Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
Cool. And you guys can't see this, but the Barbieheimer poster behind Tony's head is slowly becoming Pee-wee's Big Adventure. All right, I feel like Connor never gets to vote at the end or decide. So, Kirk, I have a feeling where you may go, but I'll let you go next.
All right. Yeah, pretty predictable. I can appreciate the various postulations you guys have put forth and how they might relate to bigger picture here, or a type of film that should be admired and celebrated. But, like Tony said, comedy is highly subjective. And I think this specific brand of comedy, this character, I find to be incredibly annoying. And so perhaps for me, the straight character would just be somebody who could just provide some refuge from the unending, insanity that we're subjected to. So it's a no for me, but I do like it. And I will say, in the dinosaur resort or whatever, that seems like I've never seen that scene before, but it seems like a direct, like Fallout New Vegas directly pulled that. I don't know if you've played the game, but so the influences, I will just say the influences feel like the ripples have extended far beyond even the cinematic world.
Yeah, totally true. I didn't even think about the Fallout feeling right there. All right, so one yes, one no. Connor, I've said you're least often in this spot. How are you feeling?
Okay, no, I do. I like this movie. I like its fun-loving spirits. But let me tell you about my big but. Okay, there's a line in the movie that made me laugh. The but is what I mentioned earlier. I think there's something more I'm wanting out of it. The inconsistency. There's something lacking there. I feel like I worry as I say this. You guys have also made good points back to my critiques. Like I have had to concede. I concede totally what Anthony was saying, that we're not supposed to take the humility thing at face value. I agree. I think he's right about that. I take it back. But at the same time, it's like, I worry about, on the one hand, being like a certain character in a certain film that we were not supposed to mention. Tony already did. I'm talking, of course, about Cody from Barney's Great Adventure, okay? Who has this kind of cynicism. He doesn't accept the zany fun of Barney. He doesn't want to believe there's such a thing as a big purple dinosaur dancing around. Okay, I feel like I'm playing that role. But the Barney's Great Adventure can make me have that thought. It can have a thing that I take away from it, and I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that character, that he thinks he's too cool for Barney. I have moments like that all the time, okay, where I think I'm too cool for Barney, okay? It also applies in this case. I just think that this movie doesn't have anything I can take away from it in the same way. So I do have to say no, but I do enjoy it. I had a good time. I don't know what Anthony's gonna do now. He's getting up to
smash his laptop and
just bang my head forever.
Don't do it, Anthony. I'm sorry.
Like the
change it back.
Spice World. Just give me a rope so I can go hang myself.
Now I'm just moving to get water. All right. Thank you, Connor. Interesting reaction. It was no transit. It was a When Harry Met Sally moment, I'm afraid. So it's not in. We have 706 movies, no Pee-wee. We'll move on. I'll fight another day. But for now, last section, fan favorite section, in which these three will nominate a film. And what's our rule again? Whoever claims a decade, the next person cannot use a film from that decade. Now, I think, Kirk, you picked this one. I went before that, I believe. I don't know who went least recent. Was it Connor or Tony? Well, Connor or Tony, do you have the list?
Recent. I was the least recent.
Okay, so Tony, decide the order.
All right. I'll just go first because I want to claim my decade. I was thinking about pitching something from the 50s, but I'm like, no, I there's a movie that jumped out at me looking at my list, and it's one that it's not the 50s. Don't worry, Connor. His eyes got big. He turned into Large Marge for a second, or not the guy who died in the accident. But no, this is a movie that I know Connor has seen. Actually, I'm assuming at least one of us will have not seen it. It's a Japanese film. Shocker. It's from the 2010s, 2016. It's by Japanese auteur Koji Fukada. It is called Harmonium. It is an extremely dark, malevolent film. It's a drama, and it's basically about a man. It's kind of a family drama about a man who runs a workshop, and he has an old friend who has just been released from prison, and he gives him a job working in the workshop, and he kind of starts living with the family at their house, and things escalate from there. It is a nightmarish, horrifying, slow-paced, little twisted gem. This is a classic Tony movie. This is a throwback Tony movie. This is a like a OG 706 era Tony movie. I don't think I've pitched one of those in a little bit, but this is a movie I'm eager to revisit, and I think we get some really interesting discussions about it. There's a lot of interesting elements of this movie. It's got a very kind of ballsy script, I would say, and some very specific ways that'll jump out at you. And I think it'd be fun to do an episode on, if fun is indeed the correct word. And then I'll have let's have Kirk go next.
All right. Interesting choice there, Tony. And so I guess, yeah, I'm not really sure what to go with. You said that was 20. What did you say that was?
2016.
All right. I'll take the 90s here. Sorry, Connor, if that's yours. I'll go with the film. I just came back from Vegas, as our co-hosts know, my co-hosts know, but feel like I'm in the mood for something to do with Vegas or gambling or that type of universe. So I chose I'll choose Rounders, 1998. Matt Damon, Edward Norton, directed by John Dahl, and it also has John Malkovich in it. I did forget that. Rounders is an interesting one. The director is certainly not very famous, and I think it was not a script that really blew people away. If I'm remembering correctly, maybe I'm conflating it with a different film, but basically it's about this cash game grinder in New York City. He kind of plays in the underbelly, the clubs of New York City. Matt Damon, also aspiring law student. He loses it all to a Russian-backed outfit guy named Teddy KGB, played by John Malkovich. Very thick Russian accent, instantly iconic. And the rest of the film just kind of goes from there. His friend Edward Norton, Worm, played by Ed Norton, is this stereotypical fuck up, bad influence, trying to pull him back into the life of degeneracy. And it's a really interesting glimpse at the psychology of gambling, but also of people who endeavor to strike out on their own in a less conventional way. You could use artists and various creatives as an analog for poker players, just how they're traditionally shunned and ostracized, or perhaps, or not ostracized, but we look at them with some sense of paternalism, because it's like, why haven't you grown up? And so at least those who are struggling, and those who make it, we praise and laud. But there's more to say about the film, but I'll just leave it there. It's pretty good it's a very interesting film about that's well made and well researched, about a community that extends into various aspects of Americana and our culture as it stands today. So I'm interested to talk about it, but if not this round, maybe we'll get it on another round.
All right. That was I did feel like you're kind of setting yourself up, Kirk, for saying you just left Las Vegas, so you're choosing Leaving Las Vegas as your film. But Rounders, interesting choice. Okay, so Connor, what are you going with? We have the 90s, and what decade was your film, Tony?
The teens.
The teens. Teens claimed.
Well, I was worried when Tony mentioned the 50s, because I have three movies that I was deciding between. All of them are from the 50s. It's one of those weeks. It's that kind of mood. I know when Anthony's picking, this is like my golden opportunity. This is when I can get the old movie in. And Okay, I was kind of deciding between different ones. What the hell? I'm gonna pander a little bit. I'm gonna go with 1955's Kiss Me Deadly, which originally was recommended by Anthony. So I know that he likes this movie, so that's maybe a little cheap. But we have to watch this for the podcast. I think like I want to watch this movie again right now. Like this is a movie that is just so captivating. It's a noir film, but from the 50s, kind of outside of like the kind of like the heyday of noir. A little bit kind of pulpier, a little bit more B movie esque, a little bit more kind of nightmarish, iconic, fever dream esque, and it's a nightmare version of noir in a way. And I think it boils it down to its essence. It's what you'd want a noir movie to be, you know, kind of in your memory in a way. And it's so cool. It has this crazy, crazy ending, amazing music. It's just a very unique cinematic experience. And, whether there's meat on those bones, what do we take away from it? As we argued about in this episode. Well, we have to talk about it, but I think there's just something about this movie it's just a must watch.
Yeah, very, very cool choice, Connor. I have a story about the movie in a second, but I'll do it after I pick, so it doesn't reveal anything about it. What was the name of your movie, Tony? The Grudge? What was it?
The Grudge. You mean Ju-on, the original Japanese title? No, Harmonium was my movie.
Okay. So I haven't seen yours, Tony, or Kirk's. I've never even heard of Kirk's. Never even heard of your movie either, Tony.
Okay.
Drawn in each direction for various reasons. So this is one of the times where everyone knocked it out of the park. So
Really?
I need reasons.
I was gonna say I think Connor like came to play, and I was gonna say by harmonium I meant the 400 blows. Which no, no. Yeah. So I think I have a bit of an uphill battle here, but I'll do my best. As I kind of said, I don't think we've done a movie in quite this vein in a while, and it's a very particular tone and a very particular feel. I haven't seen Rounder. I actually do. I do own the VHS for Rounders, but I've never watched it. So I would like to check it out. It's always good to see John Malkovich in something. Maybe this is the one where he plays a jewel thief. We'll find out. Kiss Me Deadly is very cool. It's one I need to see again, but it makes some very daring choices for sure, as Connor kind of alluded to. But yeah, Harmonium has such a mastery of tone. It is such a beautifully directed film. It has such an incredible sense of pacing and atmosphere. Everything is so tightly and perfectly controlled, from the acting to the cinematography to the sound design. I think it's just such a gem of a movie, and I think it is very powerfully like effective on a visceral level, as I do love as well. I would love to return to that kind of space. I'd love to do another Japanese film as well. As for what it has over the others, I can't say like what really makes it better than the others necessarily, but I think those things do distinguish it. And if you're in the mood for something that has this feel of this just being in a dream, knowing something is wrong, and just that feeling of dread and seeing all of your worst fears slowly come to fruition in the most horrible possible way, if that sounds at all appealing, if you're anything like me, that sounds like heaven. So check it out. That'd be my recommendation.
Well, this is exciting because you usually just nominate like anime films from Japan, so this is different.
Yeah. Let's see. Rounders, I do think these are three great choices, so I'm not going to try to disparage the other two, which feels like a more apt strategy on certain episodes where the choices are pretty rough. But yeah, I think you got three winners on your hand. Connor, have you ever seen Rounders?
I have not, Kirk.
Oh wow! So this is a rarity. Three cinephiles such as yourselves that haven't seen this film, which is, fairly iconic, and you can tell by the caliber of the actors, perhaps something that is worth watching, maybe not. I guess that's not a good metric to use, but this is a film that is universally regarded as the most kind of mimetic, or whatever term you want to use, the classic poker film. If you wanted to learn about poker players and how they think, how they act, how they interact with people outside of their communities, and outside of their ecosystem, you would watch this film. So just from that perspective, the sociological value of it, I think, can't be overstated. And it's damn entertaining. I will say that it's a movie that, has some 90s patina on it, but it also feels fresh. It's not too lofty in its ambitions. It's a very grounded film at times, and I think it's one of Matt Damon's better performances, to be honest. And I think there's something to be said about a subculture that is described with such accuracy, and is so often misunderstood, and the way in which this film deftly kind of highlights the potential perils of gambling, and of its related activities, but also ties it back into this like a broader understanding of how we process and appreciate risk in our daily lives, even as people who aren't gamblers, or people who are working 9-to-5 jobs, right? So, and then finally, it's John Turturro's in it as well. It's a really great view of New York. There's some really great shots. Typically, gambling movies are associated with Vegas, the glitz and glamour of Vegas. This is very gritty. This is very seedy, and it's a great New York film on top of everything else. So, but I do realize that you may have your proclivities, Anthony, and you might have shown your hand when you're like, well, after I choose my movie, I'll tell you the story about the movie I choose, aka Connor's movie. But I think you didn't intend that. But that's what it sounded like at first listen. But anyways, Rounders, good film. If it doesn't get chosen, hopefully we can watch it in the future for a podcast. So I might renominate it, because it is one of the ones that I think would do well.
No, I really am pulled in all three directions, Kirk. It's an even ground. Or I was starting to weigh towards one. But Connor, what are you going to do?
Well, okay, to rebut, Tony's Harmonium I've seen. I do really like. I'm a big fan of Fukada's work, maybe more his earlier stuff like Hospitality, but Harmonium is really cool. I think it's a great entryway to Fukada, kind of the essential, and arguably better than Hospitality. But it's a cool one, and in the true Tonian spirit. As for Kirk's Bounders, no, I'm kidding, Rounders, it's a total blind spot for me. I'd be going in completely blind. I don't even know anything about the movie. Sounds like an incredible cast. I don't really understand poker, but I believe it's about John Malkovich and Ed Norton meeting on Grindr or something. I think that'd be kind of weird if it was in the 90s. Anyway, I'm not sure what Kirk said with the plot synopsis, but it sounds interesting. Certainly a great cast. And Kiss Me Deadly, I just think it's a really cool pick. To say against it, it's kind of not like my typical, like it's a bit more of like a kind of like a thrill, a kind of curiosity. I do like to have movies that are very like thematic and kind of like weighty and grave. This is a movie that's kind of more of like a fun discovery. This is, I guess, more in the Wizard of Speed and Time vein. It's kind of a rediscovered film. I think it has a lot of merits to it. It kind of benefits from the distance we have from it. But I just think it would just be a real, like, I think we would all have a lot of fun with it. I think there's value to that and having fun with an old movie. I think there's something special about that. This podcast gives us the opportunity to do. And yeah, it's my 2 cents.
All right. Now, I feel like Kiss Me Deadly is a pretty weighty film, I guess, depending on how you think about it. So I've been feeling kind of a yearning for 90s like media. So I am drawn to Kirk's, and he sold me with Edward Norton, which usually works. I am thinking about it. Tony's film excites me. Tony, did you say it was a horror film or did it have just horror elements?
I wouldn't call it a horror film. I'd say it's a drama, but it definitely, in terms of the kind of the vibe and the atmosphere, you could say, I think tonally, it's kind of in the ballpark of something like Killing of a Sacred Deer, if that gives you an idea.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm kind of excited. I know nothing about it. It's always fun to kind of explore someone like that filmography who's kind of a big blind spot, I suppose. Connor's film, and this is the story, Kirk, is I received a copy of the Criterion as a gift this past summer, and I was going to finally rewatch it, and I couldn't rewatch it because I realized I got an email from Criterion that they had sent out a bunch of discs that didn't work. And so I couldn't rewatch the movie. And when I finally did, I was really excited still by it. But I'm also a little uninspired by Tony's reaction to having seen it. I was hoping for a little bit more energy as he described it. That would have made me say, okay, let's do something I've seen before again and, get these kind of fresh reactions. So that's one kind of negative against it. I'm going to go with Harmonium, I think. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to try something new. And I feel like it's right. I feel like it's the right choice. I want to do Kiss Me Deadly still, but Harmonium. I'm psyching myself out.
Good pick.
All right. I'll have what she's having.